For more than 50 years, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations has been the leader in promoting mutual understanding between the United States and China, the most important relationship of the 21st century. The National Committee strengthens that relationship by helping people on both sides of the Pacific to understand one another better and to address issues of mutual concern through exchanges, dialogues, and other activities. These programs address key issues such as economic relations, rule of law, security, public health, and the environment, in the belief that constructive Sino-American relations benefit both countries as well as the global community.
Good evening. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to welcome audiences from over 70 venues throughout the United States, Canada, and China to our 18th annual China Town Hall. Each year, we convene China Town Hall because we believe in the importance of educating the public about all that is happening in the U.S.-China relationship. This past year, in fact, exactly 12 months, has been pivotal for bilateral ties, culminating in President Biden and President Xi meeting in San Francisco. Since then, we've seen progress on a number of issues, including bilateral communication and fentanyl control. And just last week, we saw Secretary Yellen traveled to Beijing to meet with senior Chinese leaders. Yet deep differences still divide our two countries. Can the countries capitalize on this cooperative period, or will we return to a period of tense ties? We're thrilled to have the Deputy Secretary of State, Dr. Kurt Campbell, with us here tonight to discuss the current state of U.S.-China relations and answer your questions. Prior to assuming his current position, Deputy Secretary Campbell served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the National Security Council. During his distinguished career, he's also served in senior positions at the State Department, Defense Department, Treasury, and NSC. Full disclosure, he served as a director of the National Committee from 2013 to 2020. And also full disclosure, I'm proud to call him a friend. To participate in the conversation tonight on Twitter, use the hashtag CTH2024. You can also scan the QR code on the bottom of your screen to take a poll and share your thoughts on U.S.-China relations. Let me begin with a few of my own questions for Deputy Secretary Campbell. Kurt, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. I was just noting this is your second appearance on China Town Hall, and it's only our 18th time. But can
I just say, please call me Kurt, if you would, Steve.
It's tough to call you Deputy Secretary.
It's tough even for me, actually. So,
tell us where we are in U.S.-China relations, where we've come from, and where we're going, and what happens assuming President Biden is reelected.
So let me, if I could, first of all, it's an honor to be with you, Steve, and I welcome everyone from many places around the United States who have an interest and are focused on where U.S.-China relations are going, and I welcome you all, and thanks for the opportunity. I want to say a word just quickly about Steve. If we are able to manage our way through a very challenging time, I acknowledge that, and I live it. It will largely be due to key people who are passionate and committed and determined to find common ground. I know of no person who has dedicated more of their life to finding that common ground than you, Stephen. We have not always agreed, but the truth is I've learned an enormous amount from you, and I appreciate the opportunity to give and take. So look, I would say this. I think when President Biden came into power, I think there was a sense that China was testing us and was proceeding under the belief that the United States was in some sort of hurtling decline, and that they believed that they could press us in key ways, take advantage of certain opportunities in technology and security and the like. And I think what President Biden and his team has sought to do is put in place a consequential set of steps. First, beginning with investment in the key areas of national strength, which increasingly, Steve, as you know, will be in technology. Issues like semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, robotics, and recognizing that this is the high ground for national power and strategic competition. Secondly, working closely with allies and partners to build a consensus around maintaining the global operating system, which we believe has been so beneficial, particularly the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the last 60 or 70 years, I would argue that they've been the best with respect to lifting people out of poverty, huge amount of innovation. And I think the U.S. commitment to peace and stability has been a large part of that. And then I think building on those foundational pieces has been a substantial bilateral commitment to finding common ground, but also being clear-headed about engagement with China. And so what we've seen is a series of engagements, probably the most effective, as you indicate, Steve, was in San Francisco, in which the two leaders underscored that, yes, there are elements of competition in our relationship. We want to keep those elements healthy. We want to keep that competition from veering into confrontation or conflict. We believe that the way to do that is to keep lines of communication open and the ability to be able to engage when there's misunderstandings or potentials for accidents, but then at the same time find those areas where it will be essential to maintain communication and working together. I note, Steve, that you were in Beijing just the last couple of weeks with the most distinguished delegation of business and financial leaders, trying to figure out what's going on in China right now and what is the nature of our economic relationship. But we underscore fundamentally the need to work on existential questions like climate change. We think the people-to-people dimension, which has animated so much of our relationship in the hopes of people on both sides, seeking steps to increase trade, travel, those things are practical steps that we need to take. But at the same time, I know this is a long answer, we are having to deal with challenging issues like China's support for Russia in the Ukraine war. Obviously, we're trying to manage carefully and engage on issues where we have differences of view. And I think ultimately the visit of Secretary Yellen, the call between President Biden and President Xi that preceded that, the upcoming visit of Secretary Blinken, these are all indications that both sides, I think for now, are determined to keep U.S.-China relations on a steady, stable path.
Has a date been set for Secretary Blinken going?
I think it probably has, but I don't think I'm supposed to announce it. But it's, and I'm learning all these things now in this new role. But it will be coming up soon. And look, we think this will be a major visit. I think we want to display other elements of the relationship in terms of education, business, and we expect him to see the senior leaders as well.
You mentioned my visit a couple of weeks ago and where we had the opportunity with some business leaders to meet with President Xi. One of the issues he raised, and one which I've actually raised, is kind of the over-securitization of U.S.-China relations. You know, we've seen cranes, chips, EVs, batteries fall within now a definition of national security. What's going on there and what should we do? He's concerned that ultimately when you, and he implicitly recognized the Chinese do this too. Yeah. So can the two sides engage in a discussion of what is national security, get a definition?
Well, look, it's going to be important to have those discussions, Steve. I would simply say that the larger context here is important. Last year was an absolute banner year in trade. There's substantial investment flowing in both directions. Lots of Chinese goods come to the United States, lots of opportunities. Yes, we do hear from Chinese interlocutors occasionally about, gee, you're targeting our social media companies. I would just simply say that our social media companies are not allowed to engage in China. So there is an unequal playing field to begin with. And so, look, I think what's important on our part is to explain clearly what it means to have high walls or high fences and small yard, to make sure that only the most careful things that require scrutiny are observed with respect to potential controls or areas that we would prevent certain kinds of engagement with China. And much of those efforts tend to be in technology areas, AI chips and the like. And I think ultimately our focus in technology are in dual use capabilities that potentially could have security uses that are antithetical to our interests. And I think we've been clear about that with our Chinese interlocutors. I will also say that if you listen carefully what Secretary Yellen indicated on her recent trip, is that we're also concerned by the potential of China seeking to use their overcapacity to flood American and other global markets. And she's warned, I think appropriately, and she has worked assiduously to build stronger ties between the United States and China, but she's warned her economic and Treasury Ministry of Finance counterparts that if those steps are taken, we will not sit by idly. And what happened 10 years ago on steel with Chinese products basically squashing American competition, we won't and cannot sit by idly to let that happen. And so I do think we've sought to explain clearly what our issues are. And I also believe that those conversations are helpful and they are ongoing, Steve. So this is not a dialogue of the deaf. It is not a situation in which we're not interacting regularly. We are, and we are explaining clearly and unambiguously what our concerns are.
Can we negotiate white lists, things which are basically going to be telling businesses it's okay both in terms of goods and investment?
So, look, I think we've sought in private conversations with businesses to basically give indicators where there are warning signals, and we've also indicated areas that we think are unexceptional more generally. I think today there's much greater clarity in the business community about what's acceptable and what is not. But I will also say, Steve, if I can, I think the limiting factor is not the U.S. government response. I think you were there with the business community. The truth is there's some real challenges currently to operating in China. I know Chinese friends interlocutors are trying to deal with that, but they have a long way to go. The business environment is not nearly as welcoming as it was 15 or 20 years ago. And I think being honest with Chinese interlocutors about that is important. It's, oftentimes, we'll listen to Chinese interlocutors and they'll say, look, we're opening up and we're following reform. But then if you really chase that down and ask for specifics, they're not as forthcoming.
Yeah, we certainly raised those issues with President Xi, the concern about the Chinese economy, concern about the investment environment, and he responded, that reform and opening has been the foundation for China's success, and we'll go in that direction. We'll continue to go in that direction. Of course, the business community says, well, the proof is going to be in the pudding. Yeah. We got it exactly what you're saying. We have to see how things are.
Just on that, Steve, I will say this. Look, I don't envy the current generation of financial diplomats in China. The challenges are enormous, but they're also following in the wake of literally the most effective global diplomats, financial engineers of modern times. Wang Qishan, Liu He, these people were incredibly effective at managing the opening to the West and trying to preserve certain advantages. I think some of the current team have a lot to prove, and I think there's pressure on them to try to be able to take the necessary steps to deal with youth unemployment, property challenges, issues about domestic demand, global confidence generally in among Chinese firms. These are all things that, frankly, are unrelated to the United States that China will have to deal with.
We want to go to our first audience question, which is going to be from Isabel Mashlab at Northwestern University's Town Hall. Isabel, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Isabel Mashlab. I'm a junior from Iowa City, Iowa, and I'm studying international studies and political science. Thank you so much for having me. My question is, President Xi Jinping said to President Biden last week on their phone call that China is not trying to outcompete the United States. Do you believe this to be true? How would you describe the current U.S.-China relationship?
Before you answer that question, thank you. It's a great question. We're trying something new this year, which is we're polling our audience on what they think China is, one word, and we have competitor, partner, frenemy, or enemy. And obviously, competitor looks like it's 57%, frenemy 30%. Enemy only 6%, and partner 7%. So that's kind of obviously we are. This is a very unscientific sample, but
it's a sophisticated sample, and I appreciate the question very much. Thank you for that. Look, my sense is that China is a serious country. I think they seek advantage where they can find it, and yes, I think they are fierce, intense competitors, as is the United States. I think competition is what has driven the United States forward. It is what animates China's purpose, both domestically and the global stage. And so I don't think we should in any way discourage fierce competition. I think the key is to make sure that that competition is fair, that it is transparent, and that it doesn't veer into conflict or instability. And I think that's our goal as we go forward. But I do believe that China is competing to win without question.
Yeah. Let's go to our next question to Tulane University Town Hall. Gabriella.
Hello, Deputy Secretary Campbell. My name's Gabriella Preziosi, and I go to Tulane University. Thank you so much for having me. My question is, given the complexities of the United States-China relationship, what are the key areas you believe the United States can and should seek engagement with China, and how would you prioritize these areas?
We also polled the audience, this coincidence, we also polled the audience on this. So let's see what the results of that were. In other words, where are the areas that the audience thought we could cooperate? And it looks like there's a glare.
Trade and investment, illicit drugs looks substantial there. I can't tell if that's, looks like it's a 9 or 9%. I'm hard to tell exactly. But
people to people looks like it's 54%. International conflict resolution, which I take it refers to the Mideast and Ukraine, 22%. Technology, 19%. Climate, 28%. Illicit drugs, 30-something%, and trade and investment, 27%. But where do you think we could cooperate?
These are all, this is a great list. I just want to commend you on this format, Steve. It's wonderful to link all these people together, and it's great to see students so engaged, and I commend you on that, the important role of thinking about the world and asking these hard questions. Look, these are all critical issues. At my core, I believe that the essential fundamental responsibility of the United States and China is to take climate seriously as an existential issue. I really commend the work, the passionate work that Secretary Kerry, as our climate envoy, undertook really without any pause and tremendous intensity over the course of the last 3 years. But I will also say I think the United States has been ambitious in a number of areas. We're going to need to see more from China, and I think given their slowdown, some of their more ambitious climate goals have fallen by the wayside. I think we're at a situation now where China's emissions are over 50% of global emissions and rising. They've made a big deal about not financing coal plants externally, but have continued them domestically. These are areas that we've got to be clear about. And I think, we tend to just be grateful when Chinese interlocutors come to various international climate fora. We need to see more progress there. I think the United States has taken very challenging steps. Our issues are going to be follow through more than anything else. For China, it is to make the kind of commitments and follow through on them domestically more than anything else. I think people to people issues are important, educational opportunities. I do think there are areas where the United States and China can work together. When I was Assistant Secretary here in the past, we worked quietly on issues that were challenging on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea. We also worked, Steve, on Burma. Mm-hmm. I think there are areas where our interests overlap, and we can perhaps not necessarily cooperate, but align and make sure that we are in close consultation and communication. Ultimately, what we have to be about is building habits of cooperation. And in truth, despite the remarkable engagement between our two sides, the sense of entanglement economically and commercially, we have not built the habits of necessary cooperation that will be essential if the U.S.-China relationship is to flourish into the future.
How destructive is China's relationship with Russia in terms of building these habits of cooperation? So this morning, as you know, I watch the Chinese news every morning. Yeah. And this morning I awakened to Xi Jinping sitting at the head of the table with Lavrov sitting on his left and Wang Yi sitting on his right on a rectangular table. And I said, boy, it was the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and China. But it's pretty destructive.
Yeah. So look, guys, I will tell you that, Steve has helped me and tutored me and lectured me. The one area that we disagreed at the outset, but I'm going to say on air that I think I was right about, was the relationship between China and Russia, which I think
disagree with.
Well, you did a little.
I tell you what the other position is.
We fought about it, but let me tell you what I think what we're facing. Friends, look, we often hear from Chinese interlocutors like this is a red line, this is a core interest, and we have to trespass very carefully on areas that are so important to their sense of national identity and purpose. For the United States, the awakening globally, our most important mission historically has been the maintenance of peace and stability in Europe, right? And I will say, and Steve knows this, we warned our Chinese interlocutors in advance of the invasion.
Yes.
I'm not sure they completely believed us or thought that maybe it would be a smaller thing, not an all-out move and push. I think the Chinese leadership were surprised at the enormity of the initial actions and then were alarmed by Putin being on the defensive almost immediately. From that stage early in the conflict, I think Chinese interlocutors have made a decision to provide the necessary wherewithal in terms of machine tools, joint use capabilities, a whole variety of capacities, Steve, to basically allow Russia to retool. Now, I think initially that was a defensive endeavor. They did not want to see regime change. They didn't want to see Putin fall. Let's remember that the relationship that she has invested the most with globally is not a Western leader, but President Putin. They've met dozens of times, up to 50 times, hundreds of hours. They've endeavored to build a partnership that's largely based on agreement with the West and the United States. But we're in a different situation now. So Russia is almost completely retooled. And they now pose a significant threat going forward to Ukraine, but to the surrounding region. And see, the point that we're trying to make to Chinese interlocutors is that this is our strategic interest. This is the most central issue, and China is involving themselves in a way that they think that we don't completely understand. We do understand what's going on. This is a substantial effort. We're making clear to European partners the risks of this, and we have told China directly, if this continues, it will have an impact on the U.S.-China relationship. We will not sit by and say everything is fine. For instance, if Russia's offensives continue and they gain territory in Ukraine, that will alter the balance of power in Europe in ways that are, frankly, unacceptable from our perspective. And we will see this not as just a Russian unique set of activities, but a conjoined set of activities backed by China, but also North Korea. This is antithetical to our interests. And we've been clear and transparent with them about this.
It was so interesting in the meeting with President Xi. He was talking about economic resilience of China. So he's sending a message, the economy, we are resilient. We're going to make our 5.2%. It's the new model. We could do 10, but that would be qualitatively not good growth. Then he said something, he says, we're resilient. Look at our history. Then he said in 1956, the Soviet Union withdrew its machinery from the northeastern China. And I kind of went, wow. He knows this history.
2 years later, they detonated a nuclear weapon, and
China did. But China showed its but that he used that as an example was kind of, to me, quite interesting.
Well, Steve, I'm not sure you remember this, but we were talking after the Bali summit, and I mentioned to you that President Xi used that very same historical experience, and I think occasionally what he will say to Western interlocutors is that no matter what you do, you try to withhold capabilities, we're going to persevere and we'll overcome obstacles. Look, I don't think that relates directly with Ukraine. I would simply say that I do not believe what China is doing here is in the interests of Europe, the United States. But I will also say I don't believe that China fundamentally wants to see at this juncture the borders of Europe fundamentally rewritten through conflict. I don't think that is in their strategic interests.
On something we disagreed about slightly, but then we came to agreement, which is official contact between U.S. government officials and Chinese government officials. How is it today, and how's your relationship in terms of communications with your counterpart?
Look, Steve, at the time, one of the things that Steve would ask me about, he said, look, you've got to meet more, you've got to engage more the Chinese ambassador. I will tell you now, it can be told, I was meeting with him regularly. It was really other meetings. He really wanted higher level engagement. This is our former ambassador, Qin Gang. And Steve was very good at trying to build those bridges. At the time, I think Steve was the first to note that Qin Gang's potential trajectory would have made him one of the most powerful officials in the conduct of Chinese foreign ministry, basically of the last 30 or 40 years. He had that potential ahead of him. Now, we still don't really know exactly what happened. This is a topic that you cannot discuss with Chinese interlocutors. If you brought his name up, there would be an immediate silence and there would be no discussion of him. But the truth is that Steve's encouragement to me and others, we engaged with them intensively, was very helpful in terms of passing messages at points of tension in cross-strait relations. We are actively engaged with all our counterparts. I've had a recent call with the executive vice minister. We see the ambassador regularly. I think we are now back to a situation in which the lines of communication are almost fully open. What we're still seeking, Steve, is more engagement on the military and operational side. And I think the Chinese system is ready to take those steps, and we're ready to meet them halfway in keeping those lines of communications open.
Where it's in the afternoon, let's go to the University of Hawaii to Brent White to ask his question.
Hi, good afternoon. Brent White, Chief Global Officer at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our question is there any possibility that the Level 3 travel advisory to China will be lifted or reduced in the near future? It serves as a disincentive to resuming student and scholarly exchanges, which both the United States and China have expressed a desire to increase.
Look, thank you, Brett, for the question, and welcome and aloha to all our friends out in Hawaii. I had a good opportunity. I was on the board of the East-West Center, and I had a chance to work with your institution extensively. Thank you for the work that you are doing. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I would just simply say that this is certainly an issue under active consideration, and I accept your premise that these travel advisories have served as an inhibition to the kinds of rebuilding the kinds of people-to-people and other academic exchanges that we've seen in the past. So I would just simply say under active consideration.
The follow-up question actually from Pin Nee from Wanxiang America and Dennis Simon from ICAS both ask, you know, presidency at the dinner you were at talked about 50,000 American students over the next 5 years going to China. What's your view of that initiative? And is there a U.S. strategy? I mean, I assume we think this is good to have Americans study in China, speak Chinese, and kind of understand their culture better and come back and work in the State Department is a good thing.
Steve, I would simply say I first met you when well, not my first, but my first really active engagement with you was part of an initiative that I did in the previous Obama administration called 100,000 Strong, right, in which I tried to take active steps, actually work to build a foundation that would actively promote American students studying in China. And we reached that goal of 100,000 over a couple of years, and we were proud of that. Now, a host of things have taken place. COVID, other challenges and restrictions, some on our side, some on the Chinese side. I do not believe the environment is as hospitable for educational exchange as it was in the past. And I think both sides are going to need to take steps. It's not just the United States. But we're in a situation now today, Steve, where the number of Chinese students is on the upswing from China to the United States. And the number of American students studying in China has plummeted absolutely. And that's plummeted for a variety of reasons. And it's not only that Americans are looking at other places and some choosing to stay home, but I think they do have some concerns about studying in China currently. And there are concerns about academic freedom and the like. Nevertheless, some degree of academic exchange is very much in our interests, and I support that, and I support steps to increase those opportunities and exchanges as we go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important. Is the department, I know the department has an initiative to get more Chinese speakers in the lower levels of the, is it succeeding?
Look, I think the truth is, Steve, we're trying to build capacity across the department in capacities associated with the Indo-Pacific. At the core of that is an understanding both in language, history, culture of China. And I think I think we're coming along, but Steve, these are not initiatives that can bear full fruit overnight. It takes a long time. Capacity building is one of the hardest things in the U.S. government. And so ask me in a few years.
Yeah. I can ask you something today, though, which is, and I'm always amazed, it's like fake news. If you live in China, can you get a security clearance to join the Department of State?
If you've lived in China?
Yes.
A large number of the people that I work with have lived in China and have spent time in China. So the person...
The answer is yes, of course.
Yes, of course.
People tell me, no, you can't. I go, that's
every single person, Steve, that you talk to in the White House and the State Department has lived in China, not just as diplomats, but as students and changing or traveling around. So no, that is not the case.
What are our allies saying about our China policy? Are you getting support, dissent?
I think we're in a better place now than we were a few months ago. I think there were look, Asia's complicated. They have a little bit of the Goldilocks. You know, they don't like it when it's too hot, but they don't like it when U.S.-China are building what they view as a G2 over their heads. They want prudent, careful diplomacy. They want their interests preserved and their circumstances not dealt with above their heads. I think it would be fair to say that we are in close consultations with allies and partners about our relationship with China. I think more than anything else, Steve, they appreciate we're talking to them more about U.S.-China relations. I think in the past, sometimes we did not share as much. We're much more open about what our goals are, what our objectives are. I still think there are some countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, that worry that in a competitive world, they feel like they have to make choices and that they're somehow betwixt and between, and they don't seek that. They like the attention and the ability to leverage resources, but they don't want to be a pawn in a larger global competition. And we hear some of that more generally. I think there is general satisfaction about the state of U.S.-China relations. I will say two different things, though. They are worried about the economic trajectory in China. They are not as optimistic about your growth numbers as
that's not my growth
yeah,
numbers. It's
the ones
Chinese growth numbers.
And they worry about the United States as well. And so it's not just that they worry about the state of the relationship, but they worry about the domestic trajectory of both of our countries.
You've spent a lot of time with the Japanese Prime Minister this week,
yes,
who's now in D.C. Japan pretty much on the same page as we are?
I think that's the case, yes. In fact, we've talked to our Chinese interlocutors about this relationship. China, I think, has complex views, as you know, Steve, of Japan. But the U.S.-Japan relationship is our most important foundational relationship in Asia. It is grown in importance. It's no longer regional. It's global. They're with us in Ukraine, in Haiti, supporting us in Gaza, in the Pacific. I think Prime Minister Kishida is a rare leader. We've been able to really take the U.S.-Japan relationship to the next level, and it will be on full display over the course of this week. And we will also have a trilateral meeting later in this week between the United States, Japan, and the Philippines for the first time, and President Marcos will join us.
Let's go to a question from University of California, San Diego. Gary Zhu. We're not hearing you.
You're going to have to try again, Gary.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gary, a PhD candidate in political science at UC San Diego. It is great honor to ask Mr. Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell, who is also a distinguished alumni of UCSD, a question. So my question is, how do you evaluate the possibility of a military conflict between the mainland China and Taiwan over the next decade? And given your evaluation, what do you think the United States will play a role in the future game? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I want to acknowledge how important the question is, but I do want to just say a word or two. I am not a particularly distinguished graduate of UC San Diego, although I'm very fond of my time there. I do want to say that the premier meeting and conference every year that is held to basically explore with the best experts in the world where China is going, where the U.S.-China relationship is going, is hosted by UCSD. I think I saw Lei and other friends at UCSD in the audience there, and I want to say hello to them, and we look forward to that meeting in August in La Jolla, following on the meeting that was held this winter here in Washington, D.C., in which National Security Advisor Sullivan gave a key speech about the current trajectory in U.S.-China relations. But what I was going to say is my first introduction to China was a class taught by Susan Shirk. I was a young student. She chastised me. I came to class all wet. I had literally gotten off my surfboard. I brought it into class and my wetsuit was dripping wet. And she said, you know, you got to get yourself in order. You can't be so disrespectful and you can't track sand and water into my classroom. I think from that point on, I became a little bit more serious of a student. And so grateful to call her a lifelong colleague and friend. Look, the most important thing that we can do is carefully to signal responsibly our determination to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And that involves a variety of things, both communications, deployments, clear messaging. I would simply note one of the most important elements of the U.S. strategy in the recent period. In the past, it was often only the United States speaking alone about the absolute need to preserve peace and stability, to sustain the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, a status quo that we think has served the interests of the peoples on both sides of the strait. Increasingly larger numbers of international actors have spoken out as well about their desire to maintain peace and stability, to make sure lines of communication are open, and to build a degree of trust and confidence. We do see actions on the part of the PRC that are concerning, increasing military activities, deployments that concern us. But at the same time, we persevere in our determination to underscore our critical role as a key guarantor, as outlined in the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, of that maintenance of peace and stability, which we think has been a tremendous achievement that has propelled the region to greater heights. When we talk about the advances in technology, what TSMC has done is remarkable. We're grateful for the partnership that we have, unofficial partnership with Taiwan on so many different things. Ultimately, it is our professed goal to do what's necessary to preserve that peace and stability that has been so critical to the progress we've seen to date.
Let's talk a bit about kind of the ancillary effects. Tremendous effect, actually, of our China policy, especially, I would say, the last administration. We've seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So let our next question go to the New England Chinese American Alliance Town Hall, joining us from Newton City Hall in Massachusetts. Hua Wang, over to you.
Hello, good evening. So this is Hua Wang, co-chair of New England Chinese American Alliance. So thank you for inviting us to participate in this important conversation. As a community organization, we're concerned about the increasing suspicion of the loyalty and integrity of Chinese Americans, such as the China Initiative. Such suspicions not only hurt the racial minority, we all know about the Japanese American internment, but also tear apart the fabric of American society, such as during the McCarthy era. So how to protect the equal rights of the Chinese Americans and avoid stereotyping Chinese culture and people while managing the complex U.S.-China relations? Thank you.
Well, so look, I appreciate the question, and I believe that this is a very serious matter. I will simply say that President Biden, Steve, has spoken out on this. He has rejected this kind of stereotyping. He has condemned the attacks on Asian Americans that affect not just Chinese Americans, but across a broad range of groups here in the United States. He's condemned that publicly, repeatedly, and in the company of prominent Asian Americans. He's appointed for the first time a wonderful person in his administration in the White House, Erica Martsugi, who represents Asian and island communities in all things in the White House. She has been tireless in her commitment to ensuring that we're taking every possible step to prevent this kind of blacklisting and questions about the patriotism of honorable Americans. And so I think those are critical efforts underway, and we have to be able to distinguish between perhaps steps or activities, third column things that China has done in the United States, and also the activities of of Americans. And I just think this is a hard issue, and I think over time we are, I think, handling this issue with greater care and understanding than perhaps it was done 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. We're seeing a large influx of Chinese migrants coming to the United States, kind of leaving China, going sometimes through the Mideast, coming to Mexico and entering.
Steve, it has not gotten enough attention, but it is a remarkable thing. The number of Chinese economic migrants that have come to the United States over the course of the last, several months, number in the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. It is a remarkable thing. And I would just underscore that these are people, many of the people that are coming up the corridor in Latin America are absolutely impoverished with very little to call their own. Many of the Chinese migrants that are coming have had to spend an enormous amount of money to get the airline tickets, to get down to join these groups that come up to the United States. So it is a remarkable thing that we're seeing. It is a subject of some conversation. I think it's fair to say that the Chinese government is aware of it, probably a little concerned by it, but I don't think they've taken steps at this juncture to curtail it either.
These migrants seem to blend into the Chinese community in the United States rather than being in the, taken care of by municipal or state governments. Is my impression correct?
Steve, I think that's anecdotal, but I think generally the case, yes. And, but the truth is the numbers that we're seeing are large and frankly, of gathering concern.
I think if I don't end this, your staff is probably going to have me lynched. But this has been just a tour de force. This is remarkable.
No, it is my pleasure, Steve. You're the host here. It's been my honor and my pleasure. I hope to do this again. Can I just say to the people that have listened, I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate your interest. And Steve, we don't always agree, but you are my friend, and I appreciate the passion that you bring to this endeavor, this complex endeavor of charting a course for you.
I value our friendship, and I think you're really one of America's great public service servants. It's remarkable. But let me just use 30 seconds to thank our speakers and partners across the United States and China for hosting this event. Thanks to the Star Foundation for its continued generosity in funding China Town Hall. And finally, thank you to the National Committee staff for the hard work in coordinating this nationwide, this worldwide event. Thank you all.
Can I also thank my team here at the State Department? We are in the State Department today. They've labored to put this together. I'm very grateful to our technical teams and all the people that have made this possible. Steve, thank you to you and your team. Be well, everyone.
Kurt, thank you.
All right, we are going to transition to our local speaker now, but just a few words from me, and then Dan Stein will introduce John, our speaker, our distinguished speaker. So this is a veritable who's who in Muscatine, China partnerships in our audience. Thank you for participating. We have actually hosted this, Dan and I were thinking, maybe 4 or 5 times now, and every time I get the email from the group asking if we want to volunteer, I forward it to Dan and Sarah, and I kind of am hoping that they'll say, no, we don't want to do that this year, because it comes at a very busy time for us. But every time, without fail, I'll hear from both of them, yep, I think we'd like to host it. And Dan says, I'll help you find a local speaker. So here we are again. And when the Muscatine Journal called to ask, why should people attend this, or why should they be interested in this, and why are you participating? My answer is, we're the community's college. And whenever there's an opportunity to understand the people that we care about and learn something, we're the venue for that. We're going to say yes. So we're going to transition to our local speaker, whom Dan will introduce. Dan is, of course, the president of our Muscatine China Relations Committee, and distinguished experiences within business and within China. So, Dan.
Thank you, Naomi. All right, first of all, thank you, Naomi and Muscatine Community College. I think the work that she's done integrating this school with Muscatine has been one of the great things since I've moved back to Muscatine. Obviously, Jeremy has been very involved in Iowa-China relations as well, and the chancellor, the president of the whole system, has as well. So we've got a great team here. Naomi, I do always feel guilty when you send the email, and of course I'm going to say yes. And the turnout tonight is not the greatest. That's my fault. There's a lot going on, and there was a schedule change last minute, moving the time here, so I apologize to everybody about that. But anyway, we're here, and I thought that was a pretty good interview. I thought the guy from the State Department, Kirk Campbell, who I've actually met before in Mongolia, was quite impressive, and you can see why he's risen to the level that he's risen to. And a lot of the points he made, I think, were sound points about U.S.-China policy at this point. So with that said, Muscatine, as you all know, has a lot going on with China. Most folks know the history with us hosting President Xi in '85 and 2012, but I want to recognize Sarah Landy, who's really helped drive, the fact that we have this meeting and all the student exchanges that they were talking about. We are currently enacting all that. We've had students go in January. We've got a group of 40 people from MHS going next week to China. So anyway, and Krista's been a big part of our team too. So anyway, that's enough introductions. We'll get our speaker up here. Real quick, I'm going to read John's biography. So Mr. John Clark here, he's the founder and the president of Phoenix Consulting, which was started back in 2007 to leverage John's more than 21 years experience with United States businesses working in and with China companies. So that experience includes project and company due diligence, negotiations, operations, management oversight, corporate governance, and Chinese government relations, all within the Chinese cultural environment. Phoenix Consulting is pleased to have also been the official state of Iowa representative through the IEDA in China for their trade program from 2007 to 2020. That's actually how I met John. The first time I met John was in 2013, and he was leading a delegation of Iowa businesses in China. So he was the guy that we'd all interface with to set up the meetings, find partner companies. So he was the leader of that, and that's how I got to meet John. He's got an interesting background, because prior to that work, he actually was in private industry in China. So he was the country manager for Alliant Energy. So Alliant Energy, headquartered in Madison, is that right? Madison, Wisconsin. At the time, he can tell the story, but at the time they had a Asian American CEO, Chinese American CEO, he'll tell it. But anyway, they made some big investments in China in the utility industry, and John was the leader of those. So he put all those deals together, and then as they decided to unwind those deals, John was the guy doing all that too. So really boots on the ground, you know, back in the glory days of China's growth, he was in all the action. So I'm often jealous of these guys that got there 20 years before me to actually see the boom times, and we're in a different environment now, but I think John will be an interesting perspective from a lot of angles here. So without further ado, and you guys in the audience, feel free to ask any questions from that chat. You can ask John as well and get his opinion, but John Clark, thanks for being here.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to add my thanks to President DeWinter and to the other folks that have invited me here, Dan Stein for reaching out. And in starting that, Dan had asked that I speak more from the background of my business dealings in China. And that's quite a story. And so if I get off on tangents, please forgive me. If I see eyes glassing over, you know, put your hand up or something, ask a question. I welcome questions. But it was, to say it was an interesting journey would be an understatement. And, you know, why I did it is another question. The only connection I had to Asia at the time, probably like many of you, was when I was growing up and watched Shogun on TV. And I thought, culturally, that's really neat. You know, I was a kid that grew up in northeastern North Dakota, and the last thing that was expected, well, the first thing that was expected, I would move out of the state to find work. Second thing was that I probably would not end up overseas. My first trip to China. And so having what I said before, it wasn't because I was, you know, I was fluent in Mandarin or I was really knowledgeable about Chinese culture. No, I was an engineer that had worked on certain systems in a power plant. And it was actually through an odd chain of events that I came to be in, or be asked to be in the business unit. So a predecessor company to Alliant had begun investing in China. Our chairman at the time was a Chinese gentleman who was with General Chiang Kai-shek. So he was part of the party that ended up in Taiwan. He ended up in Brazil, married a Brazilian woman, ended up at Iowa State going to school for engineering, landed at the old Iowa Electric, worked his way all the way up to the top, president, chairman, CEO. And at that time, there was a need for some diversification efforts in the company. One of the things he recognized, and of course had contacts, was there was tremendous growth going on in China. China was, as Dan had suggested, was going through some boom years. And load growth there was, you know, 10 to 15 times what it was here in the U.S. And it was basically a free-for-all. Was that an environment we should have been in? Well, that might be questioned after the fact. But anyway, through a series of events, I was asked to be on the team because of this experience putting in computer systems in the plants in China. I never actually did that, oddly enough. Went into a role, I started in October of '97, as I mentioned. We had done one joint venture. We closed one joint venture just southwest of Shanghai. We were working on the second one. And so the first interesting story about that whole thing is, well, either the first trip or the second trip, I was sure I was going to get fired. We didn't have a lot of cultural training before going over. And that was a big learning curve. And I imagine it's the same for the politicians and the folks like from the State Department that are over there working. I mean, there's a bit to be learned. The culture about how you conduct meetings, how you defer to certain folks. the culture around meals, which is huge. The drinking culture at meals, as Dan will know, or anyone else that's been there. You know, I say I've left more meetings not remembering than I like to admit. But anyway, so I got there, and I participated in the negotiations of the second joint venture. That had hit an impasse. There were just some basic misunderstandings. So they said, well, John, why don't you go over to the other plant and get a look around, meet the people, because I'm going to have an operational role, oversight over our interest in the joint venture. And there were a couple interesting things about that. So I met with the plant manager, and I was promptly told that, you know, we're of course from the West. We're looking to bring our technology, which we thought was the deal of the day. And I'm in a meeting, and I'm asking questions of the plant manager through an interpreter, of course, and all of a sudden it gets kind of quiet. And he just looked at me and he said, you know, he said, this is a guaranteed return deal. We'll get you your 8%. Don't worry about any of the rest of this. That was a big wake-up call. So that's I think probably the first point, the realization where reaching out through the some of these cultural things, the dinners, the drinking, you know, really highlighted the importance of building a relationship and being able to make some suggestions, you know, a little more finesse in how we were doing things. So after that, we went to lunch. And with our representative, we had somebody from Hong Kong who had connections with the Chinese government and who was helping us. He was a finder to find deals. So we went to lunch. In that part of the country, they like to drink red wine. And John had a lot of red wine at lunch. And afterwards, the tour was done. They drove me back to the other city where the other negotiations were going on. I went back to the room and basically passed out all afternoon. Now you got to think, our CEO was known in the company for having taken alcohol off the company plane, a lot of things like that. So I was a little bit more than concerned. But fast forwarding in the future, those were the first two joint ventures. We ultimately invested in 12 plants in China across 5 different provinces. There were actually 3 of them in our sister province of Hebei. One of those near Zhengding, where Xi Jinping was when he came over in '85, that we actually built. It was a brand new plant, started completely greenfield. Going through all the operations of those, initially I was sort of, I was the link between the company here in the U.S., technically, and the plants in China. And you can imagine, not only with the 10 plants, but also we had a development and operations company in Beijing that at its peak reached, I think, 55 people, where, of course, we had to cover new project development. It was operations, it was engineering, it was finance, it was accounting, tax, everything you would think of in a regular company. And so it took a lot of time and energy, and a lot of time on airplanes, and a lot of time in China. And I'm not quite sure why my wife put up with all that, but she did. But it really proved to be quite worthwhile in the end, because originally I was in a position, I was overseeing operations. I was the interface between the U.S. company who had become Alliant from IES and the development company in Beijing. So we were involved in our capital approval process. We had to review all due diligence that went on with these new plants. And then afterwards, capital improvement programs, engineering improvement programs, things like that. And there, I was happy that I learned early on that this relationship thing. And I would say the other thing that I've told people throughout the years, even when I got into the years working with Iowa, the key thing is communication as well. You have to have a good interpreter. And they need to understand you, they need to understand your business as much as they can, because you can say a few wrong things and things will go south pretty quickly. So I was trying to think of a few stories that along the way that might be interesting. So maybe we could take a vote, much along the same line as what they were doing up here. So I have, number one, the potential of someone being buried underneath one of our cooling towers. That's number one. Number two, being surrounded by a squad of People's Liberation Army officers, not officers, rank and file, on Hainan Island, thinking we were going to get arrested. They all were carrying semi-automatic weapons. I was told at the time that there were no clips in them. I couldn't see. It got rather heated for a little bit. So that's number two. Number three is about the time that we got the call from the FBI. So, we have one number three. Everybody wants to hear about the FBI. All right. Well, that was actually quite early on, and the gentleman I'd mentioned earlier who had introduced us to a couple of the projects was coming into the country, into the U.S. to see us. And we were just a newly formed group. This wasn't very far into it. And I remember sitting in my cubicle. My boss's executive admin took a call. My boss that day was really uptight about something. I don't know if it was budget or, somebody was on him about getting more projects done or what, moving quicker, whatever. And I heard her say, I'll call him Jim. Jim, you have a phone call. And he said very curtly, he said, I can't take it now, just take a message. She said, Jim, she said, this is the FBI and they would like to speak to you now. He said, okay. Anyway, apparently the gentleman who was helping us had, let's just say, a little history. And I think statute of limitations have passed. In fact, that gentleman has passed away, unfortunately, last year. But anyway, he had a little history from his prior time in the U.S. And interestingly enough, he had brought some people with him during this trip. And one of those had a request to go see the hydraulics lab down at the University of Iowa. And it was quite a time after that. The FBI told us, carry on with everything. We're keeping track. Let us know the itinerary. We're watching. What you think? They were. Anyway, what I found out afterwards, actually because I had a locker near the FBI agent in charge at the YMCA in Cedar Rapids, that they had tracked that down, that chain, all the way out to somewhere at Annapolis, and that they had made arrests because of that. So, that's my FBI story.
John, what was it like working with IEDA and the Iowa companies, and how did that business environment change over the last 10 years, in your viewpoint?
Well, I think you can look at it from both directions. At IEDA, in the earlier years, there were more, one of our primary functions was to help Iowa companies, primarily smaller, medium-sized, sometimes larger ones, to go and take a look at the China market for market entry. And in earlier days, obviously, there were more that hadn't done it. And so there was a point where, I don't know if I'd call it saturation, but the ones who were interested, or maybe I should say there's a shifting balance, where initially a lot are interested. It's the old, hey, if I just sell a toothbrush to 1% of this 1.2 billion people, I got it made, right? Well, it turns out that it's not that easy. The Chinese are smart, they're tough negotiators, and they like playing the game. And if they can, and there's going to be a lot of competition, right? So they're going to look at your product, and they're naturally going to look at making their own. It's only natural. In fact, you know, a lot of people here in the U.S. Get down about that, and it is quite negative against intellectual property laws. However, but when we were a country starting out, I don't think it was much different. So that was one of the differences. Towards the end, so I had done that for a little over 12 years. In the beginning, it was much more about companies going over. Somewhere in 2011, 2012, it got much more political. We entered into some memorandums of understanding. We had the 4+1 MOU, we had the relationship with Hebei, the relationship between Xi Jinping and then Governor Branstad was firing up, which was very interesting in and of itself. But then it turned to be more, it was fewer companies. My office also assisted with the commodities groups. So we would bring over the cattle producers, the pork producers, corn growers, soybean association, and help out with some of their trips. There were fewer companies in the later running. And then, of course, all of the larger ones, they were already there. They had been there a long time. You know, companies like John Deere, they were well established. Sometimes our paths would cross, sometimes they would help support us, but much less by that point. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting time. And of course, prior to that, there was a huge transition in 2005, whereby, as I'd mentioned before, Alliant was expanding internationally. They were expanding everywhere because there was a thought of deregulation coming along, and they needed other sources of revenue. They wanted to diversify. However, the company, like many others in the country, had decided to invest in telecom and had done very well. And of course, we had an investment in Teleconnect USA, and then after that, it was McLeod USA. And the value of that got to be quite large, and part of that was monetized for some of the international investments. Well, the telecom bubble burst. That put the balance sheet a little bit at risk. A lot of other utilities had done some very, very dumb things. So Wall Street turned against us. 2005, I believe it was, probably late 2005, was a decision to say, look, we need to get out of this. And so my boss at the time, who was a country manager, was moved up into a central planning, financial planning role. I was brought in as the CEO of the China entity. Also the country manager was my title. We sold the development and operations company and 3 of the plants in a package deal. The other 7 plants I sold individually, or onesie twosie to certain people. And that was quite an experience as well. I had to call my boss over one time because we'd been running so hard here and there negotiating, and I got sick. And I went into the hospital on the weekend to get treatment, and they gave me an IV of antibiotics, and they said, if this doesn't work, we're going to throw you in the hospital. So I had to call my boss and have him come over. One of the more enjoyable things about international work. All right, so any other interest in the other incidents? The PLA one, that was diffused easily. My friend wasn't humored when I asked if I could get out and get a picture with him. He didn't think that was a good idea. The other story, I still don't know to this day if it's true or not, but we had invested in a plant where there were 4 units, The first two were also invested in by a large chemical company out of Hong Kong. And this was back in the day where they were frequently kidnapping heads of these large companies, and they would hold them for ransom. And I believe they had done that a couple times for this gentleman. Well, the next time, he didn't come back. And it was about the same time, as I understood it, that this plant was being built, and his wife had a number of boxes of special feng shui rocks brought in and placed under the cooling towers. Now, these are huge concrete structures, immovable, until you deconstruct. And so that was always the rumor. I sold the place. They did decommission it and deconstruct it. I still don't know what was in those boxes. Dan.
So, you know, the Muscatine kids that go over there, we try to explain to them beforehand about, you know, how being from Muscatine is a big deal because of President Xi and China and everything like that. What would you tell the audience? I mean, do you believe that as well in your experience, both Iowa and Muscatine, as far as opening up some doors or some opportunities? That's my first question. And then second question is, what's your outlook for the U.S.-China relationship from your standpoint?
You know, I'm a big believer in what I think I've heard described by President Xi, and this was earlier on, that he was a big believer in what he called the subnational dialogue. And what's been seen throughout history is that when you have a rising major power in the world, you have an existing major power, there's bound to be friction. And I think he always knew, so between Beijing and Washington, D.C., it's natural that there's going to be friction. And I think that he looks to somewhat soften that by having these relationships at the subnational dialogue level. I think it was the outset of the sister state relationships that they put a lot of energy into. What I really like about here in Muscatine is that you are really active on this and really supportive. Of course, you have a natural in with Xi Jinping having stayed here. And of course, Sarah Landy working on the Sister States Committee for so long. So it's really, I think it's really a testament to the city of Muscatine and talked a lot about communication, but I attended a function last year, Drake University, sorry to pitch someone else, but they put on what's called the U.S.-China Symposium, and Ambassador Branstad is the ambassador in residence there, of course. And so they had a former consul general, a U.S. consul general to China there, and they had the former commander of all Marine forces in the Pacific region there. And there were a couple of very interesting things that came out of that. And I don't know if it was strategy or if it was, it's hard to think it would be overlooked, but I believe they said that there was a period of time between the US and China where all communication had stopped. There were no military communications, even though we were operating in very close proximity in the South China Sea. A very dangerous situation. But then they said somebody came to the realization, they said, maybe it's better if we're talking. And so that has begun, obviously. I think Treasury Secretary Yellen was just there, ostensibly to talk about overproduction. You know, I suspect she's got a laundry list of other things, but it's a good thing that we're talking, for sure. The other thing that was interesting to note that I believe came from that Marine commandant was that he had been stationed in several locations before, because he was asked about the China-Russia relationship. And his comment was very interesting. He said, you know, I've been in a number of locations in Europe, wherever, Eastern Europe, where there have been Russians and Chinese peacekeepers placed at the same time. And he said, they just cannot get along. So the relationship between China and Russia is very interesting right now to me. Of course, they have a long history of getting along, not getting along, getting along. In fact, that's how Mongolia came to be, Inner Mongolia. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. All right, any other questions? No? Okay.
Thanks, John.
All right, you're welcome.